This is the second part of my video on energy organelles and energy molecules, which will cover primarily photosynthesis. We looked at the last video about cellular respiration. Cellular respiration takes glucose and oxygen and makes carbon dioxide and water, in the process releasing energy to make ATP. Photosynthesis, as you can see here, the reactants, the things you start with, are carbon dioxide and water. You add in an energy source, in this case light. You use that to make carbohydrates like glucose and oxygen. It's basically the reaction for cellular respiration flipped around the other way. This is done primarily in chloroplasts, which are another organelle like the mitochondria. We think it was originally a separate living bacterium that came to live within plant cells. The important things you need to know are that they function with enzymes. They have very specialized structures. Now, I don't require you to memorize these names, but on your notes you should definitely know that the stroma is where we have the liquid part of a chloroplast. The thylakoid are the stacks of the thylakoid is the membrane where we have chlorophyll. They're stacked on top of each other. They are arranged in these things called grana. Granum is one stack, many is grana. So I remember very much when I was learning biology, grana and stroma. Granum will be one set of these stacks. They're connected by lamella. The grana are connected by lamella. And then at the outside of the chloroplast, we have a double membrane. Again, this reflects the origin of these cyanobacteria that were swallowed up by a larger cell. The cell, through endocytosis or phagocytosis, the cell membrane ended up surrounding a photosynthetic bacterium, and instead of digesting that bacterium, it ended up working out a relationship where the chloroplast would provide energy for the larger cell, and the larger cell would give the chloroplast a place to live. But we still see evidence of cyanobacteria in these cells because they have that circular DNA chromosome, just like a bacterium, a cyanobacterium would. Chlorophyll is the important pigment. This is the basic image of a chlorophyll molecule. You can see a magnesium ion in the middle. This part is fairly polar. Nitrogens have those negative charges. They're holding on to the magnesium. This part, which is very nonpolar, would be embedded within the membrane of the thylakoid, and that is where we have the chlorophyll molecules all arranged on this membrane, with this nonpolar part embedded within that phospholipid bilayer, like every other membrane that we've seen in cells. And light energy strikes this chlorophyll molecule and then enables that energy to be converted into chemical energy. It would either be an ATP or, well, it would primarily be an ATP, which then ATP might be used to make something like glucose, which is a higher energy storage molecule that lasts longer than ATP does. The chloroplasts themselves, they have a double membrane. Their double membrane, has a variety of proteins in it. Some of these proteins are associated with chlorophyll, and they're able to take that light energy and build up a gradient. You notice that we have here photosystem 1, which was the first one that was discovered. It's taking our NADP and H. It's picking up electrons, and it's becoming NADPH. That's one of the cofactors that help the enzymes work within the cell. We also notice here on photosystem 2 that water is being split up into hydrogen ions and oxygen. The oxygen is a waste product. When we pull those hydrogen ions off of the water, we end up building up a hydrogen ion concentration, which, again, nature doesn't like hydrogen ion concentrations. They're acids. So in order to balance this, it allows the hydrogen ions to pass through ATP synthase, ATP synth. It's synthesizing ATP in this enzyme, and that's what allows the cell to get a lot of extra energy in the form of ATP. This would be called the light reaction. because light is required to make it happen. It's when the cell membrane establishes this hydrogen ion gradient, produces oxygen, produces NADPH, and produces a lot of ATP, which helps the cell continue many other processes. This is the light reaction. We also have the light-independent reaction. It used to be called the dark reaction, although it does not need to be in the dark to happen. Some people call it the Calvin cycle, but Calvin kind of stole his work from others. Benson was one of the ones. He fired Benson from his lab and then took all the credit for discovering the Calvin cycle. So some people try to be more inclusive, and these were the three people who worked on the Calvin cycle, were Calvin, Benson, and Bassam, to make sure they all get credit for it. And that doesn't make any sense. Calvin did not give credit to others. Earned. So Calvin did not give credit that was earned from everyone who helped make the Calvin cycle. This is an example of the Calvin cycle. You do not need to memorize the Calvin cycle, but what you need to see is that 6 carbon dioxides are going in, along with 6 waters, and we're using that to build a larger carbon molecule, carbon-containing molecule. This will become the 3 carbons, and then eventually becomes the 6 carbon glucose. In the process, we need to put in energy. This is not a reaction that would release energy. This is a reaction that absorbs energy. And that energy that is absorbed ends up going into the glucose. So when the glucose is broken in cellular respiration, now that energy will again be released. This is a way that the plant will store up the energy that it needs for longer term energy storage. It could store the glucose as a starch. It could store the glucose as a sucrose when it joins into a fructose. It could even store the glucose as cellulose, which makes up the cell wall of the plants. Glucose is a very useful molecule for a wide variety of reasons. So glucose contains a lot of energy in its chemical bonds. Carbon dioxide is a very low energy molecule. You can't break those bonds and get energy out of it. You can with glucose. So glucose is formed by putting all of this energy into carbon dioxide and water to make the glucose molecule. And then that glucose can be used as energy storage, it can be used as starch, it can be used as cellulose in order to build structures of the plant cell. And here we have the overall reaction for photosynthesis. It's the exact opposite of cellular respiration. So we have, with cellular respiration, this glucose and oxygen combining to form carbon dioxide and water. In this case, photosynthesis, we're taking carbon dioxide and water and we're making glucose and making oxygen, which is a waste product of this process. Now, don't forget, plants also do have mitochondria. They also do cellular respiration. So plant cells also do need oxygen, but they make so much oxygen in this process that there's extra oxygen left over, which ends up escaping into the environment. And while at one point oxygen was toxic to life, it was a toxic waste product that cyanobacteria were producing, it ended up building up so much in the atmosphere. The cyanobacteria became so successful that it led to the great oxygenation event, which put oxygen into our atmosphere for the first time. Now, that was originally a problem. A lot of life forms died. Mostly bacteria and archaea died from exposure to oxygen. However, some species of bacteria were able to evolve a way of making energy out of the oxygen presence, or making ATP better by breaking down glucose in the presence of oxygen, our aerobic respiration, which is what made the entire process of making lots of ATP from glucose possible. Prior to this, you may remember from cellular respiration, we had maybe 2 ATP being made from the breakdown of 1 glucose molecule. But now that oxygen is in the mix and cells evolved a pathway, mitochondria evolved a pathway to break down glucose in the presence of oxygen, now instead of making 2 ATP, we're making 38 ATP, which is much more beneficial to the cell. And that's what makes multicellular life like us possible is because we have all of that extra energy that cells are making. And that concludes this slideshow. This is a short one.